young Egyptian servant of an Amalekite that had been left to die because he was sick, and who was, upon being found, rejuvenated by David and his men, has agreed to lead them to the Amalekites that had just ruined their homes and taken off with their wives. We'll pick up the story from there. Hi, I'm Ken Godevanis, and this is Digging for Scriptural Gems. Today we study 1 Samuel chapter 30, verses 16 to 20. The Amalekites were found spread out, eating and drinking and dancing in celebration of the spoils they had attained from their raid. They had figured there were no Philistines around, as they had all gone to battle Saul far away. As such, there was no need for any of them to guard the jubilant party participants. They were safe, or so they thought. Then verse 17 tells us that David slaughtered them from twilight until the evening of the next day. That was a long battle. Now the next part of verse 17 is rather strange. It says, no man escaped, and then goes on to say, except 400 young men who rode on camels. From 0 to 400 in one verse. That's a lot of traveling. Just seemed a little odd to me. Sadly, however, I found little explanation for that fact and its implications. If you do, please share it with us in the comments on YouTube. I'd like to hear from you. Verse 18 tells us that David recovered all that had been taken by the Amalekites, and he rescued his 2 wives. All their children and all their goods were recovered and taken back. And verse 20 says, David captured all the sheep and led them away before all the other animals. As such, people were saying these flocks and herds were deemed to be David's spoil. We're going to stop there and go digging for some scriptural gems. We found at least 4 good ones today. First, we realize how mistaken the Amalekites were about the Philistines being too far away to bother them now so that they could party in comfort and ease without fear. Well, they were right about the Philistines, but I guess they never took into account David and his men and the role that he was playing. So they were taken by utter surprise. It reminds me how many of this world at the time of Christ's return will be having a merry old time and then be totally caught off guard, unprepared. What a state of affairs that will be. So sad. Don't be in that camp. Second, we note that several commentators suggest that the use of the word twilight in reference to when the slaughter began is not the best translation. They prefer to translate that particular Hebrew word as dawn. Their thinking is that David and his men saw the Amalekites reveling and felt it best to get some rest, let the enemy get really drunk, and then attack them early the next morning at dawn. And they did. The lesson here is simple. Patience is a virtue. Wait a little longer. Use your head. David, as eager as he was to rescue his wives, and who wouldn't be, he knew his chances of doing so were much better in the morning. Third, we note that God gave David a complete victory. They recovered everything plus. Why is that? Well, David had strengthened himself in the Lord, chapter 30, verse 6, and then he inquired of the Lord, verse 8. That seems to be the secret. Not to mention that David did what God gave him assurance that he could accomplish. He obeyed. Chuck Smith says, quote, the promise was fulfilled exactly, but it wasn't fulfilled as David sat back passively and said, all right, God, now you can do it. The Lord fulfilled his promise, but he used David's actions to fulfill that promise. God's promise didn't exclude David's cooperation. The promise invited his cooperation. End of quote. Too many Christians expect God to do it all. God will get us a job, thinking some CEO will come knocking on their door miraculously. Or God will get us out of debt, thinking those we owe money to will miraculously forgive our loan. It doesn't happen like that, and you and I know it. It requires us to trust God in enabling us to follow his instructions and slowly edge our way out of the dark tunnel that we're in and into some light. That's the promise God gives all of us. Fourth, we note that God gave David much more than what he had lost. Quote, "This was David's spoil," unquote, says the text. David Guzik adds more here, answering some of our anticipated questions. He writes, quote, "Some may wonder why David was allowed to keep the spoil of the Amalekites when Saul was expressly commanded not to keep any spoil from that nation." You can check that out, 1 Samuel 15, 1-3. Saul was judged by God for not obeying that command, 1 Samuel 15, 13-23. The answers are simple. First, David had no specific command from God to destroy all the spoil from the Amalekites, as Saul did. Second, David recovered what the Amalekites took from others, though he recovered far beyond what was taken from his city. Third, David was not acting as the king of Israel, representing the Lord's nation, as Saul was. Simply put, in this case, the rules were different for David. And this is an excellent example as to why we should never take a black and white approach to judging the righteousness of someone else's behavior when they behave differently in what we think are similar circumstances. There may be valid differences for it, and it is God that judges, not us, in those matters. 4 gems from this short passage dealing with surprise, patience, promise fulfillment, and the greater rewards of God. In our next passage, we'll see how David once again acts as a real leader when he settles a dispute regarding the spoils between the 400 men that had gone with him to recover the loot and those that had to stay behind because they were weaker and had no chance at the loot. Join us for that. It'll be interesting. Keep on studying your Bible. Keep on sharing these videos with others. Write to us with your questions, answers to our questions. We've asked 1 or 2 here in this passage. And then don't forget to look us up on Facebook under Digging for Scriptural Gems. I'd also appreciate it if you could subscribe to our YouTube channel so you'll be informed of when we put our posts up, or send me an email at kgod@accordconsulting.com and we'll put you on a BCC list for notifications.